Hey guys, how's it going? So this weekend is UFC Fight Night Whittaker versus Derrida, and I'm going to run through the whole card and give you guys my picks and predictions for each of the fights, so let's get straight into it. And opening up the prelims is Martin Buday versus Marcus Buchecha. So Martin Buday most recently took on Almabayev, where in the first two rounds he was just winning through being busier on the feet, not landing anything that was major or sort of fight swinging, but just staying a bit busier. But in the third round, Salikhov sort of comes back, lands big as well, and is chasing a finish, doing some real damage to Buday. But ultimately, it's Buday who took the decision win there, against an opponent though on short notice, making his debut. So a good win, but not the hardest of opponents. Before that, he had a really close fight with Andrei Arlovsky in Arlovsky's retirement fight, and this fight was really uneventful. Nothing really was thrown that was that fight changing by either fighter. In fact, barely anything at all was thrown. And there were no real moments of dominance from either fighter, with the judges' scorecards being a complete mess, but Buday taking that one by a decision win. And when he gets paired up against someone who is sort of talented and skilled and in their prime or sort of approaching their prime, he really struggles. He went up against Shamil Gaziev at UFC 296, where Gaziev just beat up on him badly for that whole first round, hurt him badly from the jump, and then in the second had him exhausted and hurt up against the cage, where Gaziev just kept nailing him with unanswered shots, took that one by a TKO win. He just got dominated. Marcus Buchecha, an incredibly talented Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu fighter who recently transitioned to MMA. He fights at ONE Championship, and throughout his career at ONE, he's mainly found success with his submissions, primarily the ones they finds early on in the first round, with sort of his only loss being a decision loss where the fight got kind of dragged past that first round. But in this fight, I see him being able to get Buday to the ground somewhat easily. If not in the first round, I can see it happening at any point in the fight, but I do think he'll at least take him down once. And once it gets on the ground, I can't see Buday surviving. So I'm going to go with Marcus Buchecha, and I'm going to say by round one submission for this one. And following that, we have Mohammad Yahya versus Stephen Nguyen. So Mohammad Yahya currently 0-2 within the UFC, with his debut fight against Trevor Peek being a very manageable debut. Trevor Peek's a pretty decent opponent, but he isn't like the most difficult to get over. But in this fight, Yahya just got beat in all areas of the fight. Peek was beating him up on the feet the whole time, even taking him down multiple times in the third. Took that one dominant decision win. And his other fight isn't much better, with him being paired up against Cowboy Fernandez, who is very good on the feet. He's very dangerous. But for this fight, he just got beat up the whole round and then dropped with a perfectly placed counter right and finished with ground and pound at the end of the first round. Really, he hasn't looked great throughout his whole career. Stephen Nguyen, only one fight within the UFC where he debuted against Jano Aarons, and while he did lose that fight pretty decisively, getting beaten in the striking pretty much all three rounds, even being knocked down in the second as well, Nguyen fired back for the whole duration of the fight. He never really backed down from the firefight on the feet, but just wasn't really able to do enough to take the rounds. But it wasn't like a complete beatdown from Aarons. And while I do think his loss in his debut is a bit concerning, I think Nguyen is a very difficult fighter to put away in his fights. And if this does go to a decision, which I think it will, I think Yahya's going to really struggle with Nguyen's sort of constant forward pressure and persistence, and the fact that he's not going to back down from a firefight. So I'm going to go with Stephen Nguyen for this one. I'm going to say by a decision win. Next up is Aslan versus Billy Elekana. So Aslan debuted in the UFC against Anton Turkalj, where in the first round he kind of struggled to get into the fight, especially in the striking, but he came back very strong in the second, even managed to find a finish in the third with an overhand right that dropped Turkalj badly, had the fight finished. A very impressive knockout to start your career. Following that, he had another really impressive performance against Rafael Cerqueira at UFC 308, where he had him really hurt early in the fight, and against the cage unloaded to the body and head to sort of mixing up his shots, and Cerqueira eventually sort of folded over. TKO win for Aslan there as well. 2 finishes in his career, but recently he did get stopped by Ion Cutelaba in a fight that really illuminated sort of how heavy Aslan relies on his striking, with Cutelaba taking him down with relative ease and then midway through the first submitting him with an arm triangle. So there is that sort of hole in his game. Billy Elekana debuted on somewhat late notice against Bogdan Guskov at UFC 311, where he had a really bad performance. He was constantly being controlled by Guskov in the wrestling, almost being submitted twice in the first round, before in the second being submitted with a guillotine choke against the cage. There were moments though where he'd take the back and hold the back, but it didn't look great for him in his debut. And while Guskov is a really tricky opponent to debut against, Elekana got absolutely dominated in the wrestling for most of that fight. He was even getting beat on the striking as well, and in this fight, I just don't see much wrestling occurring outside of sort of Elekana shooting in. But on the feet, I think Aslan will look significantly better and has way more impact behind his shots and will possibly even find a finish early. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Ibo Aslan by around 1 KO for this one. And next up is Amanda Ribas versus Tabatha Ricci. So Amanda Ribas at the start of this year headlined against Mackenzie Dern in their rematch where it was one apiece going into the third. Dern took the first quite convincingly, but as the fight went on, Ribas started to really pick it up. And even took back that second round just through sort of picking it up as the fight went on. But at the end of the third round, Dern found an opening for an armbar, managed to submit Ribas in the closing seconds of the round. Good win for Dern. Ribas really shouldn't have been pushing so hard in that fight with the takedowns and wrestling, especially against someone like Dern, and it ended how it usually does when you try and wrestle with Dern finding a submission and ending the fight. Before that, she did headline a 5-rounder against Rose Namajunas, where she predictably got outclassed on the feet. I mean, there's very little people can do to sort of outperform Rose Namajunas in the striking. But in this fight, she did have moments, particularly in the third, where she'd keep it really competitive with her wrestling and grappling, but alas, not enough. She went to the decision and lost that one quite convincingly. And while recently it's looked like her striking is sort of what holds her down in fights, when she took on Luana Pinheiro, she looked really good in the striking. Later in that fight, she landed an impressive spinning wheel kick in the third, dropped Pinheiro bad, had her finished with some follow-up ground and pound, and even before that was putting hands on Pinheiro a surprising amount, so she's decently well-rounded. It's just that recently she hasn't really had the chance to show it. Her opponent Tabatha Ricci has had a pretty on and off record, with a lot of her fights ending in really competitive decisions. Her last was against Tisha Pennington, going to an extremely close split decision where she just managed to take a really close second round. Just primarily through volume, nothing really that impactful. Won that one by a very close split decision. Following that, she had a slightly more dominant win against Angela Hill, where she took a unanimous 29-28 decision, with the striking throughout the fight being relatively even sort of edging towards Hill at moments, but Ricci was constantly getting the fight to the floor, where Hill wouldn't really be able to answer, and took that one. It sort of recently seems like that she's hit a wall with Yan Xiaonan in their fight. Ricci didn't really land anything for the whole first round, and then for the rest of the fight she was getting outvolumed badly, only being able to sort of find her grappling in certain parts of the fight, but lost that one by a dominant 30-27 decision loss, got beat up on the feet quite badly. And while Xiaonan is a really dominant opponent and she's, you know, an up there title contender, she had a very decently close, well not close, but impressive fight with Zhang Weili. Ricci's other fights just constantly concern me and how close the decisions tend to be. And Ribas is a very competent striker and also has some really solid grappling and submissions. So I think she'll likely just do better in every area of the fight. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Amanda Ribas by a decision win for this one. Next up, we have Davey Grant versus Damon Blackshear. So Davey Grant, really solid up-and-comer in the bantamweight division, with some really clean striking. He's demonstrated against Ramon Tavares somewhat recently in a fight that stayed on the feet the whole time. Grant was able to outstrike Tavares by almost a factor of double. And was outside of that was landing the way bigger shots that fight, dealing the most damage. Took a very dominant decision win for that one. Before that, he went to a decently close split decision against Daniel Marcos, where I thought he did enough to justify a decision win. Marcos only really definitively won the third round with a takedown and wrestling, but outside of that, just looked way worse on the feet, getting caught by Grant with some heavy shots. But the first was really close and ultimately went to Marcos. I can see why you'd argue a robbery. I could also see how Marcos probably could have won that, but I thought it was a Grant win for sure. And while it recently appears that Grant only has striking, when taking on Rafael Assunção, he won the fight on the feet and then managed to knock Assunção down with a spinning back fist lay in the third, dived in to lock in an inverted triangle choke, which is a really tricky submission. You don't see it very often. It's very situational, but he found it, managed to lock it in very tight, and actually submitted Assunção with it in like one of the few fighters to actually pull off one of those. So he is very well rounded. Damon Blackshear, his opponent, has been riding a very impressive win streak, with his recent win over Alateng Haley looking absolutely dominant. He sort of outstruck Alateng Haley. His Muay Thai style really worked for him there, keeping distance, landing these kicks to all parts of the body. for all 3 rounds, was sort of walking him down in the striking, won that one by a clear decision. And while his most recent fight stayed on the feet, one of Blackshear's most dangerous weapons is his jiu-jitsu and his submissions. In his fight against Cody Gibson, Gibson came out hot in the first, was sort of lighting Blackshear up on the feet, but he sort of braved that first round out. And then the second, the minute it went to the ground, he reversed position and then got a sneaky Kimura on Gibson, submitted him in that second round the minute it got to the ground. And while somewhat recently he did get put away with a brutal left straight by Montel Jackson, it was a really nasty sort of out of nowhere shot that dropped him bad and had him out. It's been a while since Blackshear's looked that sort of vulnerable in the fights. And I think he's very much improved since then. And while I think this fight will be very close at points, I think Blackshear will have more options in this fight. Grant mainly restricts himself to his striking, maybe some defensive wrestling, but that's it. Blackshear is good on both the striking and the grappling, and he presents a massive submission threat on the ground, as well as a decent sort of threat with his hands. I just see more options for him in a fight like this, with Grant maybe landing big once or twice, but Blackshear constantly walking him down. So I'm going with Damon Blackshear by round 3 submission for this one. Moving on from that, we have Muslim Salikhov versus Carlos Leal. So Muslim Salikhov most recently took on Song Kenan, with the fight ending in the first round. He landed this brutal spinning wheel kick that put Kenan down. It connected clean with his chin, put him down and out badly. Salikhov even won a performance bonus because it probably was the best finish of that card. Very impressive there. And while that finish was really impressive, Salikhov isn't really a finisher. With his fight before that against Santiago Ponzinibbio going to a very close split decision, Salikhov looked consistently just that bit better on the feet, but in the second and third rounds, it was really sort of tough to see who was winning them, because Ponzinibbio was constantly presenting a takedown and wrestling threat, while Salikhov was sort of sticking to the striking. He just barely took the decision win for that one, but it was a very low volume fight with not much to score off of. And while his biggest strength is his striking, Salikhov did get outperformed when it came to Randy Brown, who admittedly is a very skilled striker, probably one of the best welterweights who isn't ranked at the moment. But in that fight, Brown landed a nasty straight right that connected hard with Salikhov, put him down and out, finished the fight in that first round, so he is a little bit chinny, which is a bit concerning. His opponent Carlos Leal debuted against Rinat Fakretnov at UFC 308, where it was a very close fight. Leal was constantly denying takedown attempts from Fakretnov and was landing the bigger of the shots, more damaging shots throughout that fight as well. Surprisingly lost a unanimous decision though, which I thought it was going to be split decision, but a unanimous towards Fakretnov really didn't make any sense, considering I actually thought Leal won the fight, but very close fight there. And while he did lose his debut, he came back strong at UFC 313, where he took on Alex Morono, and this fight was just a complete beatdown on Morono. He got him up against the cage early, and then for the final sort of minute of the first round was just teeing off on him. Morono was out on the feet for the last minute, was stumbling around the octagon, almost sort of gets put out multiple times. And then 30 seconds before the end of the round, the referee jumps in because Morono's not defending himself, getting tagged with these big shots repeatedly. It's very hard to put Morono out as well, so if it was any other fighter, I could have seen Leal finishing them, but yeah, Leal took that one, dominant first round TKO win. And while Salikhov looks really dangerous recently, his usual performances are a lot less dominant, and he doesn't really find finishes, and I think Leal will likely land bigger shots, cleaner shots, throughout the fight. Salikhov might resort to some wrestling, but he never really does, so I doubt it. And I can see Carlos Leal landing big this fight and being able to finish Salikhov, so I'm going to go with Carlos Leal by a round 2 KO for this one. And closing out the prelims is Bryce Mitchell versus Saeed Nurmagomedov. So Mitchell's making his debut at bantamweight, but before that fought at featherweight, where his most recent fight was against Gene Silva, who there was a lot of animosity leading up to the fight, and he's one of the most dangerous prospects at the moment at featherweight, potentially going to be a title contender soon. And while Mitchell did come out really strong, actually outlanding on Silva in that first round, managing to even take him down, but almost getting submitted with a guillotine as well. The second round was dominant from Silva. He pushed forward very early on, landed some big shots to the head of Mitchell that had him sort of dazed a little bit, and then up against the cage in the clinch, locked in a ninja choke that when it went to the ground, managed to lock itself in tighter. He managed to submit Mitchell midway through the second round in that fight. Before that, Mitchell absolutely dominated Kron Gracie, who realistically shouldn't have even got that matchup in the first place, let alone be put on the main card of 310, but that's another story. But in this fight, Mitchell absolutely beat up on Gracie, took him down constantly, and in the third round, Gracie tries to pull guard while they're standing. One of the dumbest moves I've ever seen, and Mitchell just slams him to the ground, bounces his head off the canvas, puts him out, finishes the fight in the third round. Very impressive win there. But for every good win Mitchell gets, it's followed by a pretty bad loss. Like his fight with Josh Emmett, where he didn't even manage to throw a single punch before Emmett landed, I think it was his first punch, if not second punch of the fight. An insane overhand right that put Mitchell out in one of the scariest knockouts I've witnessed to this day in the UFC. So very bad loss there. His opponent, Said Nurmagomedov, most recently went up against Vinicius Oliveira, where early on Nurmagomedov looked to be the dominant fighter, especially in the striking. But as the fight went on, Oliveira started to pick it up on the feet and even out-grappled Nurmagomedov in the later half of that round, with him sort of taking the last 2 rounds despite having a badly broken rib, visibly being hurt. You could see it was affecting him, but he held in there, even damaged him badly in that 3rd round. Took a very dominant decision win for that one. Before that, Nurmagomedov picked up a really good win over Nguyen Gafarov, where he caught him in a standing guillotine very early in the 1st round when he sort of shot him for a takedown after trying to blitz in with punches. Secured a performance bonus for the 1st round submission win. Very impressive win for Nurmagomedov there. Joe Rogan moment. And while that was a very impressive finish, Nurmagomedov usually goes to these decisions that, for the most part, he loses. Against Jonathan Martinez, he once again looked very good early on. But as the fight went on, he let himself slowly get beat on the feet. Even in the grappling as well, Martinez was keeping it decently competitive. And then in the 3rd round, it was incredibly close. Martinez just took it. There are arguments that Nurmagomedov did get robbed by that 3rd round, but I thought Martinez was just doing way more damage, so I think he reasonably should have taken that one. And while Nurmagomedov's losses are usually to the best in the division, Mitchell was once one of those people at featherweight. Now as a bantamweight, could be a different story. But at featherweight, he was a ranked featherweight for most of his career, and he went up against some of the best in that division. Topuria, Emmett, Gene Silva, and he's kept it decently close, especially against Topuria, which is like crazy to me. And anything that Nurmagomedov can do, I can see Mitchell matching him and also presenting a sort of bigger finishing threat. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Bryce Mitchell by a round 3 submission win for this one. And next up, starting off the main card, is Nikita Krylov versus Bogdan Guskov. So Nikita Krylov most recently faced off against Dominic Reyes at UFC 314, where very early in the fight, he got caught with this perfectly timed counter straight. Landed perfectly on the chin of Krylov as he was blitzing in, put him out badly in a way that sort of reminded me of Conor McGregor versus Jose Aldo, and that fight finished very early in the 1st round. Reyes took a very impressive KO win there, and while that recent showing wasn't great, his performance before that against Ryan Spann showed what Krylov is capable of if given the chance, with Krylov taking Spann down multiple times that fight, most of the fight really just being a grappling match, which Krylov was decently competitive in. But at the end of the round, he managed to catch Spann in a sneaky triangle choke at the end of the 1st round when he tried to get some ground and pound in. Submitted Spann. Very impressive win, especially in grappling against someone like Spann, who's very, very good in that area. And Krylov's strongest weapon most of the time is mixing it up in his fights, with it being the main reason why he beat Volkan Ozdemir when they fought. Krylov keeping it even on the feet and ultimately just winning the fight through constantly taking Ozdemir down and holding him on bottom position or just maintaining dominant position throughout that fight. And Krylov took a very dominant unanimous decision for that one. His opponent Bogdan Guskov, as mentioned before, he's coming off an extremely dominant win over Billy Elekana at UFC 311, where he controlled him for most of that hot 1st round, almost submitting him multiple times, and then in the 2nd round managed to sink in a guillotine choke up against the cage to submit him. Good win there. And while his fight against Ryan Spann, he was getting dominated in the wrestling for that whole 1st round and almost got submitted. In the 2nd round, he started to let his hands go on the feet, and then when Spann was backing up, he landed this brutal uppercut that dropped Spann, had him finish with some follow-up TKO halfway through the 2nd via ground and pound. Very, very good win there as well. And Guskov seems to be a really well-rounded fighter, with his hands being just part of his arsenal, his grappling being another. But ultimately, he is very dangerous and he will put you away. He finished Zach Polgar in their fight in the 1st round as well, where he landed a flurry of punches on the feet. Polgar was sort of getting more and more dazed and was borderline out on the feet. He dropped down to a knee and then took 2 more big shots to the side of the head that put him out. Finished the fight midway through the 1st round, and it actually won him a performance bonus, that one, so very dominant win. And while Krylov himself is also good at mixing it up, and I think will bring a lot of resistance to each area of the fight here, I think what separates him is the fact that Guskov has really good finishing potential. Krylov is able to wrestle and strike, but Guskov is able to sort of knock people out and submit them. So I just see more ways of Guskov winning this fight than Krylov, so I'm going to go with Bogdan Guskov for this one by a round 2 TKO. Next up is Almabayev versus Jose Ochoa. So Almabayev was originally supposed to fight Ramazan Temirov in this card. Jose Ochoa stepped up late notice, so it's sort of a late minute fill-in. But Almabayev, at the start of his career, he was 4-0 within the UFC with some really good wins over names like Jose Johnson, who admittedly does struggle with grapplers and wrestling because of his height and lankiness, but this fight was just complete domination the minute the fight went to the ground from start to end, and Almabayev took a very dominant 30-27 for that one. His fight after that and his last win was over Matheus Nicolau, where surprisingly Almabayev was struggling to get his takedowns off. He had to stay on the feet for the majority of the fight, but even on the feet, Almabayev's striking looked really crisp. A bit low volume, that was his only issue, but he was keeping it competitive and even managed to knock Nicolau down in the third round. Took a very dominant 29-28 decision there. But recently he did take his first loss in the UFC to Manel Kape, who was headlining an event with him 5 rounds. To which in the first 2 rounds, it was definitely leaning towards Kape, with him dealing significantly more damage on the feet, and while the stoppage in the third was a bit controversial with an unrecognized eye poke sort of starting that sequence for Kape to finishing him, and the finish itself being a bit premature, Kape would have likely won if it did go to the decision, with him having the better striking of the two by a long shot and sprawling most of Almabayev's takedown, so even in the grappling department, Almabayev wasn't really able to get much off. His opponent, Jose Ochoa, debuted in the UFC against a really, really tough opponent in Lorna Kavanagh, where he has given Kavanagh probably one of his toughest fights yet. Kavanagh was looking dominant for most of it, but Ochoa was really hurting him at points. Kavanagh ended up winning that one 29-28, primarily just through looking that small amount better when it came to the striking, but very, very close fight. Ochoa had a much more dominant performance recently against Cody Durden, where he beat up on Durden in the first round. Did struggle with Durden's takedowns and wrestling throughout that first round, but beat up on him. And then in the second round, almost instantly, Ochoa lands his left hook, put Durden down and out, finished the fight that way. Very impressive finish. And while his recent finish over Durden makes him look sort of this dominant striking force, Durden is a very easy guy to beat up on the feet, and you can actually put him away pretty easily if you are somewhat skilled or have any inkling of finishing potential. And Ochoa was sort of struggling with his wrestling in that fight, something that Almabayev will be trying to push consistently through this fight. And while Ochoa could land nicely and put Almabayev away, it's actually probable that that's going to be how he wins if he does. I can more realistically see Almabayev wrestling his way to a decision, sort of negating any striking threat from Ochoa throughout the fight. So for that reason, I'm going to have to go with Almabayev by a decision win for this one. Moving on from that, we have Shara Magomedov versus Marc-Andre Barriault. So Shara Magomedov was recently handed his first loss in the UFC by Michael Venom Page in his move up to middleweight, where he seemed to really struggle to push forward and impose himself on someone like Page, who has a very big presence in the octagon himself. Page constantly was moving and evading really every kick and punch he threw, while he'd blitz him with his own sort of combinations and land pretty hard shots on Magomedov, just being that foot ahead of Magomedov when it came to the striking the whole fight and taking a very dominant 30-27 decision. Before that loss though, Magomedov was looking like the next big thing at middleweight, with him collecting a large amount of hype behind him following his finish over Armen Petrosian at UFC 308, where he silenced the concerns that he doesn't have any finishing power, landing this brutal double spinning back fist knockout in the second round. In a knockout of the year contender, it was a really vicious knockout, came out of nowhere, looked really sleek, very stylish. But it should be mentioned that before that, he was seriously struggling with Petrosian. Petrosian was chopping at the legs, kicking to the body. It seems like he struggles with people who match his style and have a very reach-heavy striking approach. And while Magomedov usually wins his fights, some opponents have really kept it close, such as Michael Olasejchik, where Magomedov took the fight by decision, dealing significantly more damage with his shots and landing slightly more volume. But there were points where Olasejchik was throwing back and tagging Magomedov pretty heavily with decently hard shots. Just really wasn't doing enough and was wearing a lot of the damage, which made it look really bad striking-wise for him. So Magomedov took that one, but it was decently competitive at points, and Olasejchik was doing a surprising amount of damage. Onto his opponent, Marc-Andre Barriault has had a pretty unfortunate career within the UFC, constantly being put up against the next big guy at middleweight, like his fight at UFC 303, where he took on Joe Pyfer, and predictably he got brutally knocked out with an overhand right very early in the first round as well, and he wasn't able to really throw anything before being knocked out. after they got put up against a pretty manageable opponent in Dustin Stolfitz. And while he looked good early on in the round, he kind of got a bit greedy, pushed forward, and got clipped with this heavy right counter hook that put him down and out badly with some follow ground and pound to finish that fight in the first round. And while he does get finished a lot in his fights, he does have some really impressive finishes of his own. Recently at UFC 315 over Bruno Silva, he landed this big elbow in the clinch up against the cage that had Silva out badly. Actually had him carried out on a stretcher as well. Whether that was more Bruno Silva's chin or Barriault's force, we're yet to find out, but he took a performance bonus for that one in a really nasty first round finish. And while his recent performance was dominant, Barriault doesn't look nearly as dominant in the majority of his fights, with him usually being the one getting finished if he can't really find his footing, isn't able to push a pace on his opponents. And I think that's going to be something that he's really going to struggle to do against someone like Magomedov, who is always pushing forward, who imposes himself. I can't see Barriault being the one to sort of push the pace of the fight. And honestly, this matchup just looks like a top 15 layup for Magomedov. Sort of a rebound fight after his recent one against Venom Page. I feel like they're trying to give him sort of a guy who's a bit chinny that he can knock out to make his way back into top 15 contention. So for that reason, I'm going to have to go with Shara Magomedov by a first round KO for this fight. And now we get to the co-main event. Petr Yan takes on Marcus McGhee. Petr Yan, one of the greatest bantamweights in the UFC history. Everyone knows his name. His career was somewhat sidetracked by a 3-fight losing streak that ended in a loss to Merab Dvalishvili, who, may I mention, is the current UFC bantamweight champion. Complete domination against everyone he's gone up against. And in this fight, Yan just struggled with Merab's constant pressure. We see it every time Merab fights, but in that fight, 49 takedowns were shot by Merab over the course of the 5 rounds, constantly sort of causing Yan to fear the takedowns. Yan defended most of them though. Out of the 49, Merab only got 11 of them. But ultimately, this forward pressure caused Yan to not really be as active as he usually is. He was constantly keeping his hands down and trying to defend takedowns before they were even thrown. And for that reason, he was getting caught as well by shots from Merab from over the top. He actually got outstruck as well this fight, and Merab took a very dominant 50-45 decision. Yan came back at UFC 299, picked up a good win over Song Yadong, where the fight was decently close. Yan just looked that much better in the striking at different points. Yadong had his moments. He took probably the first round, but after that, Yan just kind of picked it up as the fight went on, mixed in some grappling, which Yadong kind of struggled to deal with, and took a 29-28 decision. And after that, his win over Davis and Figueiredo in their Fight Night headliner was complete domination. Yan won all 5 rounds just by beating up on Figueiredo badly, dealt with any wrestling and takedown attempts from Figueiredo, and kept it standing for most of the fight. And it was such a dominant performance, I realistically thought he should get the next title shot. They gave it to Sean instead. I mean, we saw how that turned out. Maybe it would have turned out the same if it was Yan, but that's how dominant this performance was. I thought it realistically deserved him a next shot at the title, but alas not. His opponent, Marcus McGhee, he recently had his first fight in the UFC against a ranked opponent, that being Jonathan Martinez at UFC 309, where he had an insanely good first 2 rounds. He was winning those just by beating up on Martinez. But it should be mentioned, in the 3rd round, McGhee was really hurt to the legs. Martinez was constantly chopping at the leg. In fact, it was really the only shot he threw that fight. And in the 3rd round, he had McGhee like hopping around on that one leg. And for some reason, he just abandoned the leg kicks totally, decided to clinch up with him. But I could have seen if with 1 or 2 more good leg kicks, he could have got a leg kick TKO, completely flipped the switch on that fight. Chose to clinch instead, kind of let it slip away from him. McGhee took a 29-28 decision in that one. And while McGhee couldn't find a finish in his fight with Martinez, he is a very dangerous striker, with him beating up on Gaston Bolaños when they fought. And then in the 2nd round, he landed huge on him and dropped him, having him sort of circling around on the back foot, out on the feet. And then in the last 30 seconds, he did land another massive wheel kick that sort of had him wobbling around on the feet, definitely out on the feet. The ref jumped in, called it a TKO in the 2nd round. A very impressive win for McGhee, and his hands are definitely his best weapon, with him getting a 1st round finish over JP Buys when they fought. Granted, not the best opponent, but McGhee landed a big right hook in that fight that landed clean on the chin at Buys, put him down midway through the 1st round. And while McGhee is a really good fighter, Yan has fought some of the biggest hitters in the division himself. O'Malley, Figueiredo. He's taken big shots throughout his career, and I think anything that McGhee throws at him, he will be able to take. He might be a bit stunned and wobbled at different points during this fight, but if it goes past the 1st round, I really can't see McGhee dealing well with Yan's constant pressure. He's a slick, high-volume striker, and in 3-round fights, I feel like he does manage to sort of get the same volume and pace as his 5 rounds and just sort of restrict it down to 3, and I just think he's going to do that here. I think he's going to either take down McGhee to sort of gas him out within the first 2 rounds maybe, or maybe he's just going to stay on the feet, but either way, I can just see him outperforming Marcus McGhee. And I'm going to have to go with Petr Yan by a decision win for this one. And now we arrive at the main event, Robert Whittaker versus Reinier. So Robert Whittaker recently went up against Khamzat Chimaev at UFC 308 for the co-main event. And surprisingly, he just got absolutely dominated from the bell. Khamzat took him down very quickly, took the back, and for a decently long time, Whittaker was actually defending any submission attempts, was fighting the back control decently well. But Khamzat locks in this face crank. It pushed the teeth of Whittaker backwards. That's how sort of strong he clamped it onto his jaw. Caused him to tap mainly out of panic and pain over really him being sort of put out. But still a very good submission win for Khamzat. Whittaker sort of looked really bad that fight, mainly because he just got controlled on the ground. And while his most recent performance was a pretty bad loss, up until that point, Whittaker had some really good performances, with his fight right before that being up against Ikram Aliskerov, who was sort of an up-and-coming prospect within the middleweight division. But in that fight, the experience difference showed. Whittaker was landing big. He landed this big right hand on Aliskerov in the first round, had him sort of jumping around on wobbly legs, before pushing him back up against the cage. And then when Aliskerov was holding up a high guard, he landed this uppercut under the guard of Aliskerov, put him out, finished that fight in the first round. And even before that, UFC 298 up against Paulo Costa, outside the first round where he got tagged with a big wheel kick, Whittaker looked absolutely dominant. Costa really struggled with the striking of Whittaker this fight. He was backing up on the back foot for most of the fight, which is something we don't really see from Costa. He's usually the one pushing forward. But Whittaker was just landing in droves on Costa. Took the final 2 rounds due to that, taking a 29-28 decision win over Costa. A good win for Whittaker there. His opponent, Reinier debuted in the UFC against Gerald Meerschaert, and if we're being real, he didn't look great that fight. He really struggled to employ his takedowns and grappling effectively, and early in the fight was kind of getting beat up on the feet by Meerschaert, but eventually in the 3rd round, he managed to get Meerschaert down to the ground and lock in an arm triangle to submit him. Decently good win, but there were a bit of sort of questions after that win. And leading into his fight against Kevin Holland at UFC 311, a lot of people had doubts of how capable he'd be against someone significantly better than Meerschaert in Holland. But in this fight, on the feet, he was keeping it competitive, and he actually managed to get Holland to the ground surprisingly quickly. And the minute it went to the ground, he took the back, submitted him with a rear naked choke. Very, very impressive display of his grappling in that one. But one thing still remained in question, and that was whether Derrida had decent striking. He didn't really stand out for his striking in these last 2 fights, but recently he took on Bo Nickel, at the time one of the biggest UFC middleweight prospects, and Nickel's usually dominant wrestling looked a lot more manageable in this fight. Derrida was preventing any real takedowns from being shot. He did get taken down in the first round, but from the bottom position he managed to return to the feet surprisingly quickly. And for both rounds, Derrida was just absolutely dominating Nickel on the feet. He was getting into the clinch very often, landing these knees and hooks to the body that were constantly dealing damage. And it was ultimately what led him to the finish in the second, with him sort of causing Nickel to quit before the finish by getting him up against the cage and just punishing the body. And then midway through the second, he lands this knee straight to the body of Nickel, puts him down, puts him out via a body shot TKO. Showed some very impressive striking that fight. And while Derrida does look to be getting better and better with every one of his fights, I think Whittaker's going to be where he sort of hits a wall. He very often leaves himself open to getting tagged. He was getting tagged decently in that Bo Nickel fight before sort of Nickel started protecting his body a lot more. And with Whittaker's experience, I can see him exploiting that to sort of loop around the top or land these weird tricky punches on Derrida and land big on him. And on top of that, I think Whittaker's got some pretty good takedown defense and defensive wrestling of his own. I mean, he was fighting off Khamzat for a surprisingly long amount of time, so I don't think Derrida's going to be able to sort of ragdoll him or easily find a submission on the ground. And I just see Whittaker's experience over this new sort of prospect dominating him in this fight. I mean, we saw what happened last time Whittaker went up against a prospect. It ended very badly, so while I'm not counting Derrida out, he could have a complete surprise performance here. I just think a lot of people are sleeping on sort of who Whittaker is. after a pretty bad loss to Hamzat. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Robert Whittaker, and I'm going to go with a 3rd round KO for him. So that's it, guys. That was UFC Fight Night Whittaker versus Derrida, and all my picks and predictions for the event. Right now on the screen, all of my picks and predictions, all of Cam's picks and predictions. This card's stacked. This is a really good fight night. Really excited for it. And there's not much else to say. So I'll see you guys in my breakdown video later this week. And yeah, bye-bye.